Sonic and Meg, what do you guys want to do since we're on vacation right now? Since we take a break from Pittsburgh and we're here in South Carolina, and we're in Surfside Beach, South Carolina. So what do you two want to do?
Well, we could just go to another battlefield, if that's okay with you. I mean, you've been to a lot of battlefields. You've been to Fort Henry, Fort Dawson, Roken Island, and Manassas, and Fort Sumter, all those in Balls Bluff, and Fredericktown. So that's a lot of battlefields. You've been to Fredericksburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, all that stuff. All that. Excuse me. So where do you want to go this time?
I'm suggesting that we go to Richmond and learn about the Peninsula campaign. Meg? Are you sure about this? Because we're gonna talk about a lot of stuff there, so I don't know if we can talk about everything, but we can get to some stuff there, like some of the battles been there, well, let's give it a try anyway. Let's just give it a try and see what I can talk about there. Yay! Let's go to Richmond. Welcome! We're here in Richmond. I don't know why I had this bathing suit on. Anyway, we're here in Richmond now, and I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the Peninsula campaign. And don't worry, I think we'll get into the battles during the campaign. But here's some information about it. On August 20th, 1861, Major General George B. McClellan formed the Army of the Potomac with himself as its first commander. During the summer and fall, McClellan brought a high degree of organization to his new army and greatly improved its morale, and by his frequent trips to review and encourage his units. It was a remarkable achievement in which he came to pacify the Army of the Potomac and repay the ammunition of his men. He created defenses for Washington and were almost impregnable, considering of 48 forts and strong points with 480 guns managed by 7,200 artillerists. On November 1st, 1861, General Winfield Scott retired and McClellan became General-in-Chief of all the Union armies. The President expressed his concern about the vast labor involved in the dual role of Army Commander and General-in-Chief. But McClellan responded, "I can do it all." On January 12, 1862, McClellan revealed his intentions to transport the Army of the Potomac by ship to Urbana, Virginia, on the Rappahannock River, outflanking the Confederate forces near Washington and proceeding 50 miles overland to capture Richmond. On January 27th, Lincoln issued an order that required all of his armies to begin offensive operations by February 22nd, Washington's birthday. On January 31st, he issued a supplemental order for the Army of the Potomac to move overland and to attack the Confederates at Manassas Junction and Centerville. McClellan immediately replied,
with a 22-page letter objecting in detail to the president's plan and invoking instead his urban plan, which was the first written instance of the plan's details by presenting the president. Although Lincoln believed his plan was superior, but he was revealed that McClellan finally agreed to begin moving, and Riso approved. On March 8th, doubling McClellan's resolve, Lincoln called a council of war at the White House, in which McClellan's subordinates were asked about their confidence in the urban plan. They expressed their confidence to varying degrees. After the meeting, Lincoln issued another order naming specific officers as corps commanders to report to McClellan, who had been reason to do so, provide to assume his division commanders affected in combat, even though this would have meant to direct supervision of 12 divisions in the field. Before McClellan could employ his plans, the Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston withdrew from their positions before Washington on March 9th, assuming new positions south of the Rappahannock, which completely unified the urban strategy. McClellan retold his plan so that his troops would disembark at Fort Monroe, Virginia, in advance up the Virginia Peninsula to Richmond. However, McClellan came under extreme criticism for the press and Congress when it was found that Johnston's forces had not only slipped away unnoticed, but had for many months fooled the Union Army through the use of Quaker guns. A further compilation for the campaign planning was the emergence of the first Confederate ironclad warship, CSS Virginia, which threw Washington into a panic and made naval support operations on the James River seem problematical. In the Battle of Hampton Roads, March 8th and 9th, Virginia defeated U.S. Navy ships blockading the harbor of Hampton Roads, Virginia, including the frigates USS Cumberland and USS Congress on March 8th, calling into question the visibility of any of the wooden ships in the world. The following day, the USS Monitor ironclad arrived at the scene and engaged with the Virginia. The famous first duel of the ironclads, the battle, although inconclusive, received worldwide publicity. After the battle, it was clear that the iron ships were the future naval warfare. Neither ship severely damaged the other. The only net result was keeping the Virginia from attacking any more wooden ships. On March 11, 1862, Lincoln removed McClellan as General-in-Chief, leaving him in command of the Army of the Potomac, observing till that McClellan would be free to devote all his attention to move on to Richmond. Although McClellan was assured by supportive comments Lincoln made to him in time, he saw a change of command very differently, describing it as a part of an ingredient to secure the failure of the approaching campaign. Well, now we're here at one of the battlefields during the Peninsula campaign. This is the Siege of Yorktown. Now, this is the famous spot where British surrender in the American Revolution, where George Washington and the Continental Army beat the British there. So, this is the Civil War, not the American Revolution. Anyway,
Let's talk about the siege of Yorktown. McClellan's army began to sail from Alexandria on March 17th. It was an ammunition that dwarfed all precious American expeditions, transporting 121,500 men, 44 artillery batteries, 1,150 wagons, over 15,000 horses, and tons of equipment and supplies. The English officer remarked that it was the string of a giant. With the Virginia still in operation, the U.S. Navy could not assure McClellan that they could protect operations on either the James or the York. So his plan of operative envelopment Yorktown was abandoned, and so he ordered an advance up the peninsula to begin April 4th. On April 5th, the 4th Corps of Brigade General Asum D. Keyes made initial contact with Confederate defense works at Lee's Mill, an area McClellan expected to move through without resistance. Marguerite, a fan of this, set up a successful Devon campaign by moving one company in circles through a glen. He gained the appearance of an endless line of reinforcements marching to relieve him. He also spread his artillery very far apart and had it fire supposedly at the Union lines. Federals were convinced that his works were strongly held, reporting that an army of 100,000 men was in their path as the two armies fought in an artillery duel. Reconnaissance indicated that the two keys, that the strength and the breadth of the Confederate fortifications, and he advised McClellan against assaulting them. McClellan ordered the construction of the siege, and brought back his heavy siege of guns to the front. In the meantime, General Johnston brought reinforcements to Marguerite. McClellan chose not to attack without more reconnaissance. He ordered his men to entrench in works parallel to Marguerite to besiege Yorktown. McClellan reacted to Keyes' reports, as well as to reports of enemy strength near the town of Yorktown. But he also received word that the First Corps under Major General Ivan McDowell would be withheld for the defense of Washington. McDowell was in the Battle of Manassas too. Instead of joining him on the peninsula as McClellan had planned. In addition to the pressure of Jackson's Valley campaign, President Lincoln believed that McClellan had left insufficient force to guard Washington, and that the general had been deficient in his reporting of unit strength, counting troops as ready to defend Washington when they were actually developed elsewhere. McClellan protested that he was being forced to lead a major campaign without his promised resources, but he moved ahead elsewhere. McClellan protested that he was being forced to a major campaign without promised resources, but he moved away ahead anyway. For the next 10 days, McClellan's men dug while Beauregard steadily received reinforcements. By mid-April, Beauregard commanded 35,000 men, barely enough to defend his line. Although McClellan doubted his numerical superiority over the enemy, he had no doubts about the superiority of his artillery. The siege preparations of Yorktown consisted of 15 batteries with more than 70 heavy guns. When fire is in use, these batteries would develop 7,000 pounds of ordnance onto the enemy positioned with each volley. On April 16th, Union forces prohibited a point in the Confederate line at Dam No. 1 on the Margorn River near Lee's Mill. Margorn realized the weakness of his position and ordered it to strengthen. 3 regiments under Brigadier General Howard Cobb, with 6 other regiments nearby, were improving their position on the west bank of the river, overlooking the dam. McClellan began concerned with the strength and might impel his installation of siege batteries. He ordered Brigadier General William F. Bawley Smith, a division commander in the 4th Corps, to abrogate the enemy and completely their defense work. At 3 p.m., 4 companies of the 3rd Vermont Infantry crossed the dam and routed the remaining defenders behind the lines. Cobb organized a defense with his brother, Colonel Thomas Cobb of the Georgia Legion, and attacked the Vermonters, who had occupied the Confederate rifle pits. Unable to obtain reinforcements, the Vermont companies withdrew across the dam, suffering casualties as they retreated. At about 5 p.m., Bradley Smith ordered the 6th Vermont to attack Confederate positions downstream from the dam, while the 4th Vermont demonstrated that the dam itself, the railroad, failed as the 6th Vermont came under heavy Confederate fire and were forced to withdraw. Some of the wounded men were drowned as they fell into the shallow pond behind the dam. For the remainder of April, the Confederates, now at 57,000 and under the direct command of Johnston, improved their defenses, while McClellan undertook the laborious process of transporting and placing massive siege artillery batteries, which he had planned to develop on May 5th. Johnston knew that the impending bombardment would be difficult to withstand, so he began sending his supplied wagons in the direction of Richmond on May 3rd. Escaped slaves reported to the fact that McClellan, who refused to believe them, he was convinced that the army would strengthen his estimate as high as 120,000 would stay and fight. On the evening of May 3rd, the Confederates launched a brief bombardment of their own and fell slight. Early the next morning, Hespen assisted in only one Lowe's observation of balloons and found the Confederate earthworks were empty. McClellan was stunned by the news. He sent cavalry under Brigadier General George Stoneman in ordered Brigadier General William B. Franklin's division to reboard Navy transports, sail up the York River, and cut off Johnston's retreat. Okay, now let's talk about the Battle of Williamsburg. This is the Williamsburg battlefield. I'm gonna stop talking for a while, destroying my voice. So I'm just gonna let this woman here talk about it.
Brig General Joseph Hooker's 2nd Division of the 3 Corps was the lead infantry in the Union Army advance. It assaulted Fort Magruder and a line of rifle pits and smaller fortifications that extended in an arc southwest from the fort, but was repulsed. Confederate counterattacks, directed by Major General James Longstreet, threatened to overwhelm Hooker's division, which had contested the ground alone since the early morning while waiting for the main body of the army to arrive. Hooker had expected Brig General William F. Baldry Smith's 2nd Division of the 4 Corps, marching north on the Yorktown Road, to hear the sound of battle and come in on Hooker's right in support. However, Smith had been halted by Sumner more than a mile away from Hooker's position. He had been concerned that the Confederates would leave their fortifications and attack him on the Yorktown Road. 6. Battlefield map by Lieutenant Miles D. McAllister. Longstreet's men did leave their fortifications, but they attacked Hooker, not Smith or Sumner. The brigade of Brig General Cadmus M. Wilcox applied strong pressure to Hooker's line. Regimental bands playing Yankee Doodle slowed the retreating troops as they passed by, allowing them to rally long enough to be aided by the arrival of Brig General Philip Kinney's 3rd Division of the 3 Corps. At about 2:30 p.m., Kearny ostentatiously rode his horse out in front of his picket lines to reconnoiter and urged his men forward by flashing his saber with his only arm. The Confederates were pushed off the Lee's Mill Road and back into the woods and the abatis of their defensive positions. There, sharp firefights occurred until late in the afternoon, 7. While Hooker continued to confront the Confederate forces in front of Fort Magruder, Brig General Winfield S. Hancock's 1st Brigade of Baldy Smith's Division, which had marched a few miles to the Federal right and crossed Cubs Creek at the point where it was dammed to form the Jones Mill Pond, began bombarding Longstreet's left flank around noon. Major General D. H. Hill, commanding Longstreet's reserve force, had previously detached a brigade under Brig General Jubal Early and posted them on the grounds of the College of William and Mary. Hearing the sounds of Union artillery, Early and Hill hurried in that direction. Splitting his command, Early led 2 of his 4 regiments, the 24th and 38th Virginia Infantry, through the woods without performing adequate reconnaissance, and found that they emerged not on the enemy's flank, but directly in front of Hancock's guns, which occupied 2 abandoned redoubts. He personally led the 24th Virginia Infantry on a futile assault and was wounded by a bullet through the shoulder, putting him out of action for almost 2 months. Also, per Longstreet's report of the battle, temporarily assigned to Early's brigade was the 2nd Mississippi Battalion and the 2nd Florida Infantry from Robert Rhodes's brigade. The commander of the 2nd Florida, Colonel George Ward, was killed leading a charge. Also killed in action were Lieutenant Col Thomas Irby of the 8th Alabama and Colonel Christopher Mott of the 19th Mississippi. A.P. Hill's brigade of 4 Virginia regiments suffered severe losses in the fighting, and 3 of its regimental commanders were wounded. Present on the field but unengaged or only involved in skirmishing or long-range shooting were the divisions of Magruder and the remainder of Hill's division, 8. Fort Magruder and other Confederate earthworks in front of Williamsburg. From sketches made May 6, 1862. Hancock had been ordered repeatedly by Sumner to withdraw his command back to Cub Creek, but he used the Confederate attack as an excuse to hold his ground. As the 24th Virginia charged, D.H. Hill emerged from the woods leading one of Early's other regiments, the 5th North Carolina. He ordered an attack before realizing the difficulty of his situation. Hancock's 3,400 infantrymen and 8 artillery pieces significantly outnumbered the 2 attacking Confederate regiments, fewer than 1,200 men with no artillery support. He called off the assault after it had begun, but Hancock ordered a counterattack. The North Carolinians suffered 302 casualties, the Virginians 508. Union losses were about 100. After the battle, the counterattack received significant publicity as a major, gallant bayonet charge, and McClellan's description of Hancock's superb performance gave him the nickname, Hancock the Superb. 9. At about 2 p.m., Brig General John J. Peck's brigade of Brig General Darius N. Couch's 1st Division of the 4 Corps arrived to support and extend the right of Hooker's line, which had, by this stage, been pushed back from the cleared ground in front of Fort Magruder into the abatis and heavy would about 600 to 1,000 yards, 910 m, from the Confederate fortifications. The morale of Hooker's troops had been affected terribly by the loss of Captain Charles H. Weber's battery, H. of the 1st U.S. Light Artillery, and Captain Walter M. Bramhall's 6th Battery of the New York Light Artillery. Peck's arrival on the field and his brigade's recovery of Bramhall's battery came at a critical moment for Hooker's division, which was on the verge of retreat. 3 Union regimental commanders were wounded in the battle, and Colonel William Dwight of the 70th New York Infantry was left behind on the field and captured by the Confederates. 1 regimental commander, Lieutenant Col John Van Leer of the 6th New Jersey, was killed in action.
Okay, now we're talking about Effen's Landing. There's not much to talk about on this battle here, but I'll explain it myself. Johnston ordered Major General G.W. Smith to protect the road to Barhamsville, and Smith assigned the division of Brigadier General William H.C. Whiting in Hampton's Legion under Colonel Wayne Hampton to the task. On May 7th, Franklin posted Brigadier General John Newton's brigade in the woods on either side of the landing road, supported in the rear by portions of two more brigades, Brigadier General Henry W. Slocum and Philip Gurney. Newton's skirmish line was pushed back as Brigadier General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade advanced, with Hampton's to his right. Hood was concerned about the casualties from friendly fire in the thick woods, so he ordered his men to advance with unloaded rifles, encouraging a Union picket line 15 paces away. Hood wrote a colopud of the enemy drew down his musket upon me as I stood in front of my line. Fortunately for Hood, Private John Delt of the 4th Texas Infantry had disobeyed his orders and carried a loaded rifle. He managed to shoot the Union Corps before the latter could fire. As the 2nd Brigade followed Hood on his left, the Union troops retreated from the woods to plan before the landing, seeking cover from the fire of federal gunboats. Whiting employment of artillery fire against the gunboats, but his guns had unsuccessful range, so he had disengaged around 2 p.m. Union troops moved back into the woods after the Confederates left, but made no further attempt to advance. Okay, now we're going to talk about Drury's Bluff. Now, this battle here the Union lost this battle, but here, let me explain it here. On May 15th, a detachment of U.S. Navy's North Atlantic Blockade Squadron under the command of Commander John Rogers steamed up the James River from Fort Monroe to test the Richmond defenses. The filleted, considered of ironclad gunboats USS Monitor, commanded by Lieutenant William N. Jeffens, and Glendale, the flagship. The screw gunship stock stood the Signwinner Port Royal and the twin-screw semi-Somerset ironclad USRC Naganton. At 7:45, Glendon closed to within 600 yards of the fort and anchored, but before Rogers could open fire, the two Confederate rounds pierced the lighting armored vessel. The battle lasted over 3 hours. During the time, Yandell remained almost stationary and took 45 hits. Her crew reported casualties of 14 dead or mortally wounded and 10 injured. Monitor was a frequent target, but her heavy armored withstood the blows. Contrary to some reports, Monitor, despite her square turn, did not have difficulty bringing her guns to bear and fired steadily against the fort. Naganton sustained little damage compared to Monitor and Glendale due to her semi-submersible design, but had to withdraw when her 100-pounder rifle exploded. The two wooden gunboats remained largely out of range of the big guns, but the captain of Port Royal was wounded by a sharpshooter. Around 11, the Union ships withdrew to City Point. Now, this is Handover Courthouse. This is the courthouse where they pass on through. This took place on May 27th, 1862, in Hanover County, Virginia. But this is a Union victory, so let me explain the battle. Porter's men approached Pekin's Crossing in a driving rain. At about noon on May 27th, his lead element, the 25th New York Infantry, encountered Colonel James H. Lang's 28th North Carolina on a reconnaissance patrol at a farm owned by Dr. Thomas H. Kinney. The New Yorkers, along with the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, skirmished briskly with the Confederates until Porter's main body arrived. During the outnumbered rebels up on the road in the direction of the courthouse, Porter sent out in pursuit with most of his force, leaving 3 regiments, the 2nd Marine, the 44th New York, and the damaged 25th New York, under the command of Brigadier General John H. Mannerdale, to guard the New Bridge and the Hanover Courthouse roads. Intersection a mile west of Kerman's Farm. This movement exposed the rear of Porter's command to attack the Burkle of Branch's force, which Porter had mistakenly assumed was Hanover Courthouse. Branch also made the assumption that Porter's force was significantly smaller than it was, so he attacked. Colonel Charles C. Lee led his regiment. The 37th North Carolina, along with the 18th North Carolina, had 2 cannons from Lathrup's battery. An internal assault of the 18th was repulsed, but the heavy fire almost destroyed Marldan's force when the 37th joined in. The 44th New York suffered 25% casualties, and its battle flag received 44 bullet holes. When messengers reached Porter with the news of the engagement, he quickly dispatched the 9th Massachusetts and 62nd Pennsylvania regiments back to Kinney Farm. The Confederate line broke under the weight of thousands of new troops, and they retreated through Pekin's Crossing to Ashland. Okay, now here we're at 7 Pines. This is where McClellan and Johnston get one of their biggest battles of the campaign. McClellan and Johnston, and the Union Army is very close to Richmond. The Richmond people begin to panic as Johnston's wounded here. So let's talk about this battle. Actually, I'm gonna have this men tell you about the battle.
The attack got off to a bad start on May 31st when Longstreet marched down the Charles City Road and turned onto the Williamsburg Road instead of the 9 Mile Road. Huger's orders had not specified a time that the attack was scheduled to start, and he was not awakened until he heard a division marching nearby. Johnston and his second in command, Smith, unaware of Longstreet's location or Huger's delay, waited at their headquarters for word of the start of the battle. 5 hours after the scheduled start, at 1 p.m., D.H. Hill became impatient and sent his brigades forward against Casey's division. 12. Charge of General Sickles's brigade upon rebels at the Battle of Fair Oaks. Illustration from Harper's Weekly, June 21st, 1862. Hill's division, some 10,000 men strong, came charging out of the woods. The 100th and 81st New York regiments had been placed up front as heavy skirmish lines, and Hill's assault rolled completely over them. Casey's line, manned by inexperienced troops, buckled with some men retreating, but fought fiercely for possession of their earthworks, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The Confederates only engaged 4 brigades of the 13 on their right flank that day, so they did not hit with the power that they could have concentrated on this weak point in the Union line. Casey sent a frantic request for help, but Keyes was slow in responding. Eventually, the mass of Confederates broke through, seized a Union redoubt, and Casey's men retreated to the second line of defensive works at 7 Pines. During this period, both of the high commanders were unaware of the severity of the battle. As late as 2:30 p.m., Heintzelman reported to McClellan, still sick in bed, that he had received no word from Keyes. Johnston was only 21 miles from the front, but an acoustic shadow prevented him from hearing the sounds of cannons and musketry, and he and his staff did not know the battle had begun until 4 p.m. Hill, whose 4 brigades had been fighting alone for almost 4 hours, sent a message to Longstreet requesting reinforcements. but Longstreet sent forward only Richard Anderson's brigade. Brig Gen Robert Rhodes went down wounded in the desperate fighting around Seven Pines. Colonel John B. Gordon of the 6th Alabama, a future major general, took over command of Rhodes's brigade. Most of the officers in the 6th Alabama went down, although Gordon himself survived the battle without an injury despite his clothing and canteen being pierced by several bullets. Gordon also glimpsed his 19-year-old brother Augustus, a captain in the regiment, lying among a pile of dead and dying men with a chest wound, but with the battle raging, had no time to stop and tend to him. Augustus Gordon ultimately survived his injury. Rhodes' brigade in total lost more than 50% of its strength. Also wounded was Brig Gen Gabriel Rains, a few days shy of his 59th birthday and one of the oldest officers in the Army of the Northern Virginia. Command of his brigade devolved on Colonel Alfred Colquitt of the 6th Georgia, who would eventually be appointed permanent commander of the brigade. The Army of the Potomac was accompanied by the Union Army Balloon Corps commanded by Professor Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, who had established 2 balloon camps on the north side of the river, one at Gaines's Farm and one at Mechanicsville. Lowe reported on May 29th the buildup of Confederate forces to the left of New Bridge or in front of the Fair Oaks train station. 14. With constant rain on May 30th and heavy winds the morning of May 31st, the aerostats Washington and Intrepid did not launch until noon. Lowe observed Confederate troops moving in battle formation, and this information was relayed verbally to McClellan's headquarters by 2 p.m. 14. Lowe continued to send reports from the Intrepid via telegraph the remainder of May 31st. On June 1st, Lowe reported that the Confederate barracks to the left of Richmond as being free from smoke. 15. McClellan did not follow up on this information with a counterattack by his corps north of the Chickahominy River. 16. The Battle of Fair Oaks, Virginia by Currier and Ives, 1862. Around 1 p.m., Hill, now strengthened by the arrival of Richard Anderson's brigade, hit the secondary Union line near Seven Pines, which was manned by the remnants of Casey's division, the 4-Corps division of Brig General Darius N. Couch, and Brig General Philip Cunney's division from Heintzelman's 3 Corps. Hill organized a flanking maneuver, sending 4 regiments under Colonel Micah Jenkins from Longstreet's command to attack Keyes's right flank. The attack collapsed the Federal line back to the Williamsburg Road, a mile and a half beyond Seven Pines. Meanwhile, another of Longstreet's brigades under Colonel James L. Kemper arrived on the field and charged the Union lines, but artillery fire forced them to retreat. The fighting in that part of the line died out by 7:30 p.m. During the evening, Longstreet himself arrived on the field along with the remaining 4 brigades of his division, as well as the 3 brigades of Huger's division. On the Union side, Brig Gen Israel Richardson's division of the 2 Corps arrived on the field, along with Joe Hooker's division of the 3 Corps, minus 1 brigade, and the division artillery, which were left guarding the bridges over White Oak Swamp. 17. Just before Hill's attack began, Johnston received a note at approximately 4 p.m. from Longstreet requesting that he join the battle, the first news he had heard of the fighting. Johnston went forward on the 9-mile road, with a 5-brigade division led by Brig General William Chase Whiting. Hours earlier that day, Whiting had been elevated into command of Major General Gustavus Smith's division. As the lead regiment of the division, led by Colonel Dorsey Pender, 6th and C, reached the railroad crossing, artillery guns opened on Pender's advance. This opened the segment of the Battle of Seven Pines to be known as the Battle of Fair Oaks Station. The guns were a part of Brig Gen John Abercrombie's brigade of Couch's division, and they began to put up a stiff resistance. Whiting advanced his former brigade, commanded by Colonel Evander Law, to attack the Union artillery off to his left, but was stopped by Abercrombie's brigade and his 4 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, the commander of the 2 Corps, Brig Gen Edwin V. Sumner, had brought his command into action from its entrenchments north of the Chickahominy. When told that crossing the rain-swollen river was impossible, Sumner replied, "Impossible? Sir, I tell you I can cross. I am ordered." The first 2 Corps brigade to arrive on the field was Brig Gen Willis Gorman's brigade of Brig Gen John Sedgwick's division, which contacted the attack of Colonel Evander Law's brigade. Law's attack was initiated by Colonel William Dorsey Pender of the 6th NC and was later assisted by the brigades of Brig General J. Johnston Pettigrew and Colonel Wade Hampton III. The three brigades experienced no success as Sumner brought forth 2 additional brigades and another battery of artillery from Sedgwick's division. During the final attack, Confederate Brig General Robert Hatton, one of the Army of Virginia's newest brigadiers, having just been promoted from colonel of the 7th Tennessee, on May 23, 1862, was shot in the head leading his brigade into action and died instantly. Hampton, meanwhile, was shot in the ankle. Brig Gen. J. Johnston Pettigrew was gravely wounded and left for dead on the field, later being taken prisoner by Sedgwick's division. The repeated assaults on Sedgwick's line were unsuccessful, as the latter's artillery also pounded Whiting's troops, who had no artillery to answer back. A final surge by Whiting's 4 brigades resulted in a heavy loss of casualties as Sumner mounted a counterattack that drove the Confederate force from the field. It was after this counterattack that Pettigrew was discovered and sent to a Union field hospital for the care of his wounds. Shortly before Sumner's counterattack, Johnston received 2 wounds and was removed from the field. Command of the Army transferred to Major General Gustavus Smith. With darkness approaching, over 1,200 casualties, and most of his officers killed or wounded, Whiting called off the attacks. Sedgwick's division had lost less than 400 men. 2 of Magruder's brigades reached the field at dusk, but had no involvement in any of the fighting. Whiting's 5th Brigade, the famous Texas Brigade of Brig Gen. John B. Hood, had not fought either. It had been sent off to reinforce Longstreet and was stationed in the woods some distance to the west of Fair Oaks Station. 18. General Thomas Francis Meagher at the Battle of Fair Oaks, June 1, 1862. The most historically significant incident of the day occurred around dusk, when Johnston was struck in the right shoulder by a bullet, immediately followed by a shell fragment hitting him in the chest. He fell unconscious from his horse with a broken right shoulder blade and 2 broken ribs and was evacuated to Richmond. G.W. Smith assumed temporary command of the Army. Smith, plagued with ill health, was indecisive about the next steps for the battle and made a bad impression on Confederate President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee, Davis's military advisor. After the end of fighting the following day, Davis replaced Smith with Lee as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. 19. During the night of May 31st to June 1st, scouts in Israel Richardson's division reported 2 Confederate regiments camped only about 100 yards away. Richardson declined to make a risky night attack, but had his troops form a line of battle just in case. By daybreak, however, the enemy regiments had withdrawn from their exposed location. At 6:30 a.m., the Confederates resumed their attacks. 2 of Huger's 3 brigades, commanded by Brig Gens William Mahone and Lewis Armistead, the 3rd under Brig Gen Albert G. Blanchard was held in reserve, assaulted Richardson's division, and momentarily drove part of it back, but Richardson's men rallied. They were reinforced by Brig Gen David B. Birney's brigade of Cunney's division, which had not been engaged the previous day as Birney had accidentally taken the wrong road and gotten lost. He was arrested by Heintzelman for disobeying orders, and the brigade was temporarily commanded by Colonel J. H. Hobart Ward of the 38th New York. Heintzelman attempted to have Birney court-martialed, but a military tribunal cleared him of all charges, and he was restored to command of his brigade 2 weeks later. After fierce fighting, Huger's division was forced to retreat. In his official report of the battle, Mahone stated his casualties at 338 men. Armistead's report did not give a casualty figure, but his losses were undoubtedly heavy as well. On the Union side, total losses in Richardson and Birney's outfits numbered 948 men, including Brig Gen. Oliver O. Howard, whose right arm was shattered by a mini ball, necessitating an amputation that kept Howard out of action for months. Approximately 60% of Richardson's total casualties came from Howard's brigade. Pickett's brigade, to the right of Armistead, lost 350 men. To the south, the brigades of Roger Pryor and Cadmus Wilcox were attacked by Hooker's division. Although both brigades resisted stubbornly, the order was given to retreat, which they did with some reluctance. By mid-morning, the Confederates withdrew to Casey's earthworks west of Seven Pines, and the fighting ended. 20.
Now with Johnston out of the game, the new commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, General Robert E. Lee. That's right, it's him. The moment you've all been waiting for, him joining the fight. Now, taking over the army, it starts the 7 days battles. The first battle is Oak Grove. So listen to the battle, the first clash of George B. McClellan and Robert E. Lee.
At 8:30 a.m., June 25th, 3 Union brigades stepped off in orderly line of battle. From right to left, they were commanded by Brig General Daniel E. Sickles, the Excelsior Brigade, Brig General Cuvier Grover, both of Hooker's division, and Brig General John C. Robinson from Cunney's division. Although Robinson and Grover made good progress on the left and in the center, Sickles' New Yorkers encountered difficulties moving through their abatis, then through the upper portions of the swamp, and finally met stiff Confederate resistance, all of which threw the Federal line out of alignment. Huger took advantage of the confusion by launching a counterattack with the brigade of Brig General Ambrose R. right against Grover's brigade. 5. Adding to the confusion, one of Wright's Georgia regiments wore red ZO uniforms. Many of Grover's men believed that only the Union Army had ZO units, so were reluctant to fire on their own men. When they finally realized that Union troops would not be approaching from the direction of Richmond, they opened fire. At a crucial moment in the battle, the 26th North Carolina of Brig General Robert Ransom's brigade, in their first combat engagement, delivered a perfectly synchronized volley of rifle fire against Sickles' brigade, breaking up its delayed attack and sending the 71st New York into a panicked retreat, which Sickles described as disgraceful confusion. 6. Informed of Sickles' reverse, Corps Commander Heintzelman ordered reinforcements sent forward and also notified Army Commander McClellan, who was attempting to manage the battle by telegraph from 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, away. McClellan, unaware of most details of the engagement, became alarmed and at 10:30 a.m. ordered his men to withdraw back to their entrenchments, an order that mystified his subordinates on the scene. He telegraphed that he would be arriving at the front in person, which caused a 2.5-hour lull in the action. At 1 p.m., seeing that the situation was not as bad as he had feared, McClellan ordered his men forward to retake the ground for which they had already fought once that day. The fighting lasted until nightfall.
Now, Beaver Dam Creek. Here we go. Another Union victory. McClellan has now won. Things were looking good for the Union right for now. Let's see what happens here. So here you go.
Lee's intricate plan went awry immediately. Jackson's men, fatigued from their recent campaign and lengthy march, ran at least 4 hours behind schedule. By 3 p.m., A.P. Hill grew impatient and began his attack without orders. Hill's division, minus Brig Gen Lawrence O'Brien Branch's brigade, which was placed off to the north to link up with Jackson, entered Mechanicsville and skirmished with George McCall's Union division deployed around the town. McCall fell back to an easily defensible spot on the opposite side of Beaver Dam Creek. There, the brigades of Brig Gen John F. Reynolds and Brig Gen Truman Seymour dug in, with Brig Gen George G. Meade's brigade placed behind them in reserve, Reynolds' brigade to the north and Seymour's to the south. On Reynolds' right, the divisions of Brig Gen George Morrell and Brig Gen George Sykes formed a semicircle. Supporting the roughly 26,000 Union infantrymen were 32 artillery pieces. 9. There, 14,000 well-entrenched infantry, supported by 32 guns and 6 batteries, repulsed repeated Confederate attacks with substantial casualties. 10. Jackson and his command arrived late in the afternoon. However, unable to find A.P. Hill or D.H. Hill, Jackson did nothing. Although a major battle was raging within earshot, he ordered his troops to make camp for the evening. Hill's 11,000 men, most of them Green regiments who had never fired a shot in battle, launched a series of futile attacks over the next few hours. The brigade of John R. Anderson assaulted the Union right flank, with James Archer's and Charles W. Field's brigades in support. Maxcy Gregg S. Brigade was held in reserve and did not participate in the battle at all. Directing his troops, John Reynolds gestured at the oncoming mass of Confederates and told a staffer, "There they come like flies on a piece of gingerbread." The Union artillery and musketry tore enormous gaps in the Confederate lines as they attempted to cross the creek. Although A.P. Hill had 24 guns with him, he made no attempt to use massed artillery fire to counter the Union gunners, instead sending individual batteries in support of the infantry, most of which were quickly put out of action by enemy shelling. 11. Some of Anderson's men managed to get across the creek and momentarily threaten Reynolds' position. However, he was reinforced by Meade's brigade and 2 regiments from Morrell's division. The 3 Confederate brigades were driven back with substantial casualties. Arriving on the field and realizing what was happening, Robert E. Lee hastily summoned Longstreet's and D.H. Hill's divisions. As Lee surveyed the futile attacks, Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet rode up to him. Davis asked him, "General, what is all this army, and what is it doing here?" Lee replied sarcastically, "I don't know, Mr. President. It is not my army, and this is no place for it." William D. Pender's brigade then attacked the Union left flank at Ellerson's Mill, held by Seymour's brigade. Once again, the well-entrenched infantry and massed artillery proved too much for the Confederates, and Pender was forced to retreat. Just then, Roswell Ripley S. Brigade of D.H. Hill's division arrived on the field and was ordered next to assault the Union left. Ripley charged head-on into the Union entrenchments and suffered the very worst of all with over 600 casualties, the largest percentage of them coming from the 44th Georgia, which lost 335 men and most of its officers, out of a total of 514, including its Colonel Robert A. Smith, a roughly 65% casualty rate. The 1st North Carolina suffered 50% casualties, 133 men killed, wounded, or captured, and also lost its commander, Colonel Montford Stokes. General Ripley himself survived unscathed, but came within inches of being decapitated by an artillery shell. Ripley's other 2 regiments, the 3rd North Carolina and 48th Georgia, were to the rear of the 1st North Carolina and 44th Georgia. Their losses were lighter. Union casualties around Ellerson's Mill were small. Only 40 men total were killed or wounded in the 7th Pennsylvania Reserves and 12th Pennsylvania Reserves, which were defending this sector of the battlefield. The 13th Pennsylvania Reserves lost 75 men, the highest total number of any Union outfit. Some 20 years after the battle, D.H. Hill wrote, "The attacks on the Beaver Dam entrenchments on the heights of Malvern Hill at Gettysburg were all grand, but of exactly the kind of grandeur the South could not afford." 12. As darkness fell, the rest of D.H. Hill's division came up, followed by Longstreet. While on the Union side, George Morrell's division arrived and relieved McCall, whose men were nearly out of ammunition. There was not enough daylight remaining to deploy D.H. Hill and Longstreet's divisions. Jackson did not attack, but his presence near Porter's flank caused McClellan to order Porter to withdraw after dark behind Bosun's Swamp, 5 miles, 8 kilometers, to the east. McClellan was concerned that the Confederate buildup on his right flank threatened his supply line, the Richmond and York River Railroad north of the Chickahominy, and he decided to shift his base of supply to the James River. He also believed that the demonstrations by Huger and Magruder showed that he was seriously outnumbered. This was a strategic decision of grave import because it meant that, without the railroad to supply his army, he had to abandon his siege of Richmond.
And then things start to turn around for McClellan and the Army of the Potomac. In the Battle of Gaines Mill, General Lee launched a major counteroffensive on the Chickahominy River of Virginia. Well, here you go.
The first actions of the battle occurred between noon and 1 p.m. on June 27th after D.H. Hill's division reached Old Cold Harbor, where it was scheduled to link up with Stonewall Jackson's command. Hill pushed through the crossroads with 2 brigades, which encountered unexpected infantry fire. Seeking to suppress the fire, he brought forward the Jeff Davis Battery from Alabama, but it was soon outgunned by two 6-gun batteries manned by U.S. regulars from Brig General George Sykes's division. Hill was surprised at the level of resistance, and also that he seemed to be meeting the front of the Union force, not the expected flank, so he determined to wait for Jackson's arrival before moving further. The noise from this engagement failed to reach General Lee at his headquarters, the house owned by William Hogan, named Selwyn, 9. A.P. Hill's attack. A.P. Hill's division had moved across Beaver Dam Creek early in the morning, finding the former Union line lightly defended. As they proceeded eastward and approached Gaines Mill at about the time that D.H. Hill's men were engaged, Porter formally asked McClellan to send Slocum's division across the Chickahominy over Alexander's Bridge to support him. Hill directed the brigades of Maxcy Gregg and Lawrence O'Brien Branch to spearhead the assault, as they had not been engaged at Beaver Dam Creek and were well rested. Gregg was held up by skirmishers from Colonel Hiram Burton's 1st U.S. Sharpshooters and the 9th Massachusetts Infantry. By early afternoon, he had run into strong opposition by Porter, deployed along Bosun's Creek, and the swampy terrain was a major obstacle against the advance. A particularly bloody engagement occurred as the 1st South Carolina Rifles attacked a Massachusetts battery, but were repulsed by Zouaves of the 5th New York, which inflicted 57% casualties, 76 killed, 221 wounded, and 58 missing, on the South Carolinians, the greatest Confederate regimental losses of the day. Branch's brigade fared no better, losing 401 men in 2 hours of fighting. Following behind them, Joseph R. Anderson's brigade launched 3 assaults on the Union lines without putting a dent in them. Field's brigade became bogged down in the swamp, and some of the men in the rear ended up firing into their comrades. Some of Gregg's men reached the other side of the creek. None of the rest came close. 10. Instead of pursuing a fleeing enemy, as his orders had directed, A.P. Hill attacked an entrenched Union position, losing about 2,000 of his 13,200 men in the failed attempt. Combined with his attacks at Mechanicsville the previous day, the Light Division had lost over a quarter of its men. General McClellan was encouraged by the telegrams Porter had sent back to his headquarters a few miles to the rear. He replied, "If the enemy are retiring and you are a chasseur, pitch in." He also told Franklin to cross the river over the Duane Bridge and attack the enemy's flank if he saw a chance. But he was dismayed to hear that the 6th Corps commander had destroyed the bridge for fear of a possible enemy attack. At the same time, Brig General Edwin V. Sumner of the 2 Corps reported enemy activity in his front. McClellan's optimism was dashed, and he ordered that his headquarters equipment be packed up in preparation for the retreat. On the Confederate side, General Lee had been an active participant in the failed assault, rallying his troops too close to the front for their comfort. As Longstreet arrived to the southwest of A.P. Hill, he saw the difficulty of attacking over such terrain and delayed until Stonewall Jackson could attack on Hill's left. 11. Confederates advancing to the capture of disabled guns at Gaines Mills by Alfred Vaude. For the second time in the 7 days, however, Jackson was late. A guide from the 4th Virginia Cavalry, Private John Henry Timberlake, had misunderstood Jackson's intent and led him down the wrong road. After they countermarched, losing about an hour, Jackson's troops found the road to Old Cold Harbor obstructed by trees felled by the retreating Union Army and were harassed by sharpshooters, delaying their arrival. The first of Jackson's command to reach the battlefield was the division of Major General Richard S. Ewell, who was met by Lee's aide, Walter Taylor, and instructed to move into action immediately. Lee was concerned that Porter would counterattack the weakened troops of A.P. Hill, so he ordered Longstreet to conduct a diversionary attack to stabilize the lines until Jackson's full command could arrive and attack from the north. In Longstreet's attack, Brig General George E. Pickett's brigade attempted a frontal assault and was beaten back under severe fire with heavy losses. Pickett himself took a bullet to the shoulder, putting him out of action for the rest of the summer. Colonel Epahunton of the 8th Virginia assumed command of the brigade. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was among the party witnessing Pickett's failed attempt. 12. Ewell's attack. Ewell began his attack immediately, around 3:30 p.m., without waiting for his entire division to come online. General Lee's instructions were to advance along the same axis used by the brigades of Gregg and Branch, to maintain the momentum of the attack. He sent in his lead brigade, Louisianans under Colonel Isaac Seymour, commanding in Major General Richard Taylor's absence for medical reasons. Seymour was relatively inexperienced, and his troops became confused in the woods and bogs of Bosun's Swamp. Their confusion increased when Colonel Seymour was killed by a Union rifle volley. Major Robert O. Wheat, the colorful leader of the Louisiana Tigers Battalion, moved to the front to lead the brigade, but he was also killed with a bullet through his head. The Louisiana Brigade withdrew from the battle. Ewell's attack continued with 2 regiments from the brigade of Brig General Isaac R. Trimble. But they could not advance beyond the swamp, falling with about 20% casualties. Porter was starting to receive reinforcements from Slocum's division, and he brought forward troops to feed into gaps in his line. However, despite telegrams from Porter for more assistance, General McClellan gave no thought to the advantages of a counterattack. He asked his corps commanders south of the river whether they had any troops they could spare. When no one volunteered, he directed Sumner of the 2 corps to send 2 brigades, about 1/10 of the army, across the river, but because of the distances involved, they would not reach the scene for another 3 hours. 13. When Stonewall Jackson finally reached Old Cold Harbor, weary from the marching and countermarching, he began to arrange his troops and those of D.H. Hill to trap the Federals he expected to be driven east by Longstreet and A.P. Hill. He soon received instructions from General Lee that informed him of the current situation, and he began to prepare his command to assault the main Federal line. Faulty staff work prevented his men from moving forward for over an hour. While Jackson rode back and forth distractedly, his chaplain and chief of staff, Major Robert L. Dabney, took the initiative to find the divisions of Brig Gens William H. C. Whiting and Charles S. Winder, and corrected the garbled instructions they had received. Lee met with Jackson on Telegraph Road and expressed his annoyance at the delay in getting to the battlefield by telling him, "General, I am glad to see you, and I only wish I could have been with you sooner." Jackson muttered a reply that was inaudible under the noise of the battle. Lee then asked Jackson if his troops could stand the heavy enemy fire. "They can stand anything. They can stand that," Jackson replied. 14. General Confederate attack. Lee's assault at 7 p.m. was conducted by 16 brigades, about 32,100 men. Porter had about 34,000 men to defend the line, but many of these were worn out from the previous attacks, and command cohesion was hampered by feeding isolated reinforcements into the line to fill gaps. Nevertheless, they had the advantages of good defensible terrain and superiority in artillery. The Confederates were not able to advance simultaneously in a neat battle line over the 2.25-mile front, but rushed forward and were repulsed intermittently in smaller unit actions. On the Confederate left, D.H. Hill sent in his entire division except for Ripley's brigade, which had been badly mauled in the fighting at Beaver Dam Creek the previous day, but they encountered stiff resistance from George Sykes's regulars. The 20th North Carolina succeeded in overrunning a Union battery. Its commander, Colonel Alfred Iverson, who would later gain infamy at Gettysburg, was wounded in the assault. Meanwhile, the 5th Alabama's commander, Colonel Charles Puges, was mortally wounded and the regiment's colors captured by the 5th Maine. In the center were Brig Gen Alexander Lawton. S5 Georgia regiments, a large new brigade in their first battle. Numbering close to 4,000 men, the brigade was as big as the entire rest of Jackson's division. They pushed forward with the assistance of the Stonewall Brigade, along with Colonel Samuel V. Fulkerson's brigade and Elzey's and Trimble's of Ewell's division. Jackson's division had the distinction of containing both the largest and smallest Confederate brigades on the field as his 3rd Brigade, temporarily commanded by Lieutenant Col Richard H. Cunningham since Brig Gen John R. Jones was ill, numbered only a little over 1,000 men. It was held in reserve and did not participate in the fighting. During the assault, Arnold Elzey was shot in the head, an injury that permanently removed him from active field command in the war, and Colonel James A. Walker of the 13th Virginia assumed command of Elzey's brigade. Samuel Fulkerson was shot in the chest and succumbed to his wound the next day. Colonel Edward T.H. Warren of the 10th Virginia took command of the brigade. The Confederate right was opposed by the most difficult terrain, a quarter-mile open wheat field that sloped down to Bosun's Swamp, and then faced two lines of Union defenders on higher ground. James Longstreet ordered Pickett's brigade back into the action, supported by the brigades of Roger Pryor and Cadmus Wilcox, the other three brigades in the division being held in reserve. Longstreet wrote in his report, "I was, in fact, in the position from which the enemy wished us to attack him." 15. As the sun was starting to go down, William Whiting's division achieved the breakthrough on Longstreet's front. Brig General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade moved forward swiftly and aggressively and broke a hole in the line. 4 of the 9 regimental commanders in Whiting's 2 brigades were killed or wounded, as well as Captain William Balthus, the division's chief of artillery. Pickett's brigade also succeeded in its second assault of the day. Confederate breakthroughs on their center and right could not be countered, and the Union line crumbled. A total of 9 Union regimental commanders were killed or mortally wounded in the battle. Most of the 4th New Jersey, along with its colonel, were surrounded and taken prisoner by Longstreet's division. A lieutenant colonel assumed command of the remaining men in the regiment. Sykes's regulars conducted an orderly withdrawal from the McGee House to Grapevine Bridge. The Union brigades of Brig Gens Thomas F. Marr and William H. French arrived from the 2 Corps too late to help, other than as a rearguard for Porter's retreat. A battalion of the 5th U.S. Cavalry under Captain Charles J. Whiting made a desperate charge against the Texas Brigade, but were forced to surrender after heavy losses. By 4 a.m. on June 28th, Porter had withdrawn across the Chickahominy, burning the bridges behind him. During the retreat from Gaines Mill, Brig Gen. John F. Reynolds was also captured by the Confederates while sleeping under a tree.
Now we're almost done with the Peninsula campaign in 1862. Hey gosh. Now the Union Army, George B. McClellan is retreating. He's retreating to the Harrison's Landing in the James River. But then they clash again at Garrigan's and Golden's Farms. A short battle, a 2-day battle, which between William F. Smiths and Winfield S. Hancock. It was inconclusive battle here, so John B. and George T. Anderson of the Confederates generals here with 1 brigade and 1 division, so it was not a wasn't that very good a battle, but here, let's just talk about it.
James M. Garnett's farm, near Old Tavern, was situated on the edge of the bluffs at the banks of the Chickahominy River. Near the Garnett farm was Golding's Plain, belonging to Simon Goulden. Between the 2 farms was a precipitous ravine, a creek, and a hill named Garnett's Hill. Union soldiers from Brigadier General William T. H. Brooks's brigade of William F. Baldy Smith's 2nd Division of the 6th Corps began placing artillery pieces on Garnett's Hill the night before the battle. This activity was resumed by Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock's brigade of the same corps the following morning, June 27, 1862. 6 batteries of reserve artillery were placed, 5. While the Federals worked, Confederate soldiers of Major General David R. Jones's division began taking up positions in the area. Brigadier General Robert Toombs's brigade positioned themselves at the west side of the ravine, while Colonel George T. Anderson's brigade took up a position northwest of the area, less than a mile from the Garnett House. 6 Anderson's and Toombs's artillerists were ordered to fire on the Union soldiers whenever the opportunity presented itself. The Federals, now preparing for a general engagement, were told to avoid a clash with the Confederates. 6. The result was a brisk shelling that lasted about an hour and ended in a Confederate withdrawal. The Union's 23 well-positioned guns withstood the Confederates' 10 guns, which were situated in an open field. 7. Later, some of Major General Lafayette McLaws' men advanced towards the Union line at the Garnett Farm at about 4 p.m., but withdrew after 10 minutes under heavy fire. There was a lull in the subsequent hours, ending with Toombs's attack on the Union line at about 7 p.m. 8. Toombs was ordered to reconnoiter or feel the enemy. Instead, he engaged the Federals in a sharp and sustained fight. After nightfall, Toombs's advance was repelled by Winfield Hancock's brigade after about an hour and a half of fighting. 9. The Confederates suffered some 271 casualties during the day's conflict. 10. The action at the Garnett Farm accomplished little. 11. The following day, June 28th, Union and Confederate soldiers clashed again near the Golding House. 12. Jones suspected that the Federals near the house were withdrawing and authorized Toombs to perform a reconnaissance in force to ascertain whether this was true. However, Toombs turned the reconnaissance operation into a full engagement and advanced with some of Anderson's men. Before he could be countermanded, the Confederates had already been repulsed by the Sixth Corps.
Now, this is a short but indecisive battle at Savage's Station between General John B. Beauregard something's Confederate divisions and a strong Union rear guard led by Sumner. Now, this is the Confederates develop a new weapon, a railroad gun, which is a gun, which is a pad on a track where you put the wooden thing up, and then you put the gun up there, develop a gun on top of it, and then you use it. Here's the Battle of Savage's Station.
Contact between the armies occurred at 9 a.m. on June 29th. On the farm and orchards owned by a Mr. Allen, about 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, west of Savage's Station, 2 Georgia regiments from the brigade of Brig General George T. Anderson fought against 2 Pennsylvania regiments from Sumner's Corps for about 2 hours before disengaging, suffering 28 casualties to the Pennsylvanians' 119. The highest-ranking casualty was Confederate Brig General Richard Griffith, who was mortally wounded by a Union shell fragment. 8. Magruder, who was alleged to be under the influence of morphine to combat a bout of indigestion, was confused and became concerned that he might be attacked by a superior force. He requested reinforcements from Lee, who ordered 2 brigades from the division of Major General Benjamin Huger to assist, under the condition that they would have to be returned if they were not engaged by 2 p.m. 9. Meanwhile, Jackson was not advancing as Lee had planned. He was taking time to rebuild bridges over the Chickahominy, and he received a garbled order from Lee's chief of staff that made him believe he should stay north of the river and guard the crossings. These failures of the Confederate plan were being matched on the Union side. However, Heintzelman decided on his own that his corps was not needed to defend Savage's Station, Sumner's and Franklin's being sufficient, so he decided to follow the rest of the army without informing his fellow generals. 10. Magruder was forced to give up the 2 brigades from Huger's division at 2 p.m. and was faced with the problem of attacking Sumner's 26,600 men with his own 14,000. He hesitated until 5 p.m., when he sent only 2.5 brigades forward. Brig General Joseph B. Kershaw commanded the left flank, Brig General Paul J. Sims the center, and Colonel William Barksdale, Griffith's brigade, the right. Franklin and Brig General John Sedgwick were on a reconnaissance to the west of Savage's Station when they saw Kershaw's brigade approaching. Their immediate assumption was that these were men from Heintzelman's corps, but they soon realized their mistake. This was the first indication of Heintzelman's unannounced departure, and Sumner, for one, was particularly outraged, refusing to speak to Heintzelman the following day. Union artillery opened fire, and pickets were sent forward to meet the assault. 11. Magruder's attack was accompanied by the 1st Armored Railroad Battery to be used in combat. Earlier in June, General Lee had hoped to counter the approach of McClellan's siege artillery by rail by using his own weapon, a 32-pounder Brooke naval rifle, shielded by a sloping casemate of railroad iron, nicknamed the Land Merrimack. It was pushed by a locomotive at about the speed of the marching infantry. 12. However, even with this impressive weapon, which outgunned anything the Federal artillerists possessed, the results of Magruder's decision to send only part of his smaller force against a much larger enemy were predictable. 13. The first Union unit to engage was one of Sedgwick's brigades, Philadelphians led by Brig General William W. Burns. but his defensive line proved inadequate to cover the 2-brigade front of Kershaw and Semmes. Sumner managed this part of the battle erratically, selecting regiments for combat almost at random. He sent in 2 of Burns's regiments, and then the 1st Minnesota Infantry from another brigade in Sedgwick's division, and finally 1 regiment each from 2 different brigades in Brig General Israel B. Richardson's division. By the time all of these units reached the front, the 2 sides were at rough parity, 2 brigades each. Although Magruder had been conservative about his attack, Sumner was even more so. Of the 26 regiments he had in his corps, only 10 were engaged at Savage's Station, 14. The fighting turned into a bloody stalemate as darkness fell and strong thunderstorms began to move in. The land Merrimack bombarded the Union front, with some of its shells reaching as far to the rear as the field hospital. The final actions of the evening were by the Vermont Brigade, commanded by Colonel William T. H. Brooks of Brig General William F. Baldy Smith's division. Attempting to hold the flank south of the Williamsburg Road, the Vermonters charged into the woods and were met with murderous fire, suffering more casualties of any brigade on the field that day. The brigade as a whole took 439 casualties. The 5th Vermont Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis A. Grant, lost nearly half of its men, 209 of 428.
Now we're gonna go to the Battle of Glendale and White Goat Swamp. Now Glendale has a lot to talk about here, so I'm gonna have him talk about it for me, but this battle here is between George B. McClellan and Robert E. Lee. Yeah, but Robert E. Lee has 45,000 troops on this battle, and McClellan only has 40,000. But the casualties are not that high, but they're just 3,000. But still, that's a lot, though. But so anyway, here's Glendale.
Lee's intended simultaneous thrust against the entire flank of the Union Army of the Potomac in transit failed to materialize on June 30th. As with many of the 7 days battles, Lee's elaborate grand strategy was poorly executed by his commanders, who were unable to coordinate the intricate details in the field. From the northwest, Major General Benjamin Huger was slowed by felled trees obstructing the Charles City Road, the result of the efforts made by pioneers from Brigadier General Henry W. Slocum's division to halt his advance. Rather than clearing the path, Huger had his men spend hours cutting a new road through the thick woods in what became known as the Battle of the Axis. He failed to take any alternative route and, fearing a counterattack, failed to participate in the battle. To the south, Major General Theophilus Holmes's inexperienced troops, from his Department of North Carolina, attached to the Army of Northern Virginia, made no progress against Porter at Turkey Bridge and Malvern Hill, and were repulsed by artillery fire and by the Federal gunboats Galena and Aroostook on the James. By 4 p.m., Lee ordered Major General John B. Magruder's command first to join Holmes on the River Road and attack Malvern Hill to the south, on the left flank of the Union line, then later ordered him to assist Longstreet at the center. As a result, Magruder's division spent much of the day countermarching. Major General Thomas Jackson approached slowly from the northeast and spent the entire day north of the White Oak Creek, making only indifferent efforts to cross and attack Franklin's 6th Corps in the Battle of White Oak Swamp, then attempting to force the Federals back in a fruitless artillery duel in order that a destroyed bridge could be rebuilt for crossing his army, despite the presence of adequate fords nearby. In spite of his stunning victories in the recent Valley Campaign, or possibly due to battle fatigue from that campaign, Jackson's contributions in the 7 days battles were marred by slow execution and poor judgment throughout. Jackson's presence did, however, cause Brigadier General John Sedgwick to move 2 of his 3 brigades north from the Charles City Road to reinforce the Federal position at the creek. At the same time, the Union Army near Glendale also faltered in its initial deployment. On the evening of June 29th, the 3rd Division of the V Corps, under command of Brigadier General George A. McCall, was ordered to take up a defensive position ahead of the Glendale intersection to head off any Confederate thrust made in that direction. Moving slowly after dark on inadequate roads, the brigades of McCall's division became lost and overshot the crossroad, only realizing they had missed their objective sometime in the early morning hours of June 30th. Backtracking toward Glendale, the division arrived near dawn, 11, where it halted on its march to rejoin Porter, awaiting new orders. The gap in the Union line created by Sedgwick was noticed and plugged by McCall's 3 brigades after McCall and his brigadiers soon realized, to their genuine surprise, that nothing stood between them and the advancing divisions of Longstreet and Hill coming from the direction of Richmond. Slocum's artillery engages Huges, engraving by Alfred Vaude. At 2 p.m., while Longstreet and A.P. Hill waited for the sounds of Huges' expected opening assault, Longstreet interpreted distant unidentified cannon fire as the signal to begin the coordinated attack. He opened upon McCall's line with his artillery, and McCall's artillery soon returned counter-battery fire. 11 nearby, Lee, Longstreet, and visiting Confederate President Jefferson Davis were conferring on horseback when they came under heavy artillery fire, presumably blind fire from the Parrott rifles of McCall's Pennsylvania artillery units, wounding 2 men and killing 3 horses. Hill, commanding in that sector, ordered the president and senior generals to the rear. Longstreet ordered Colonel Micah Jenkins to silence the Federal battery, an order he would later state he intended to mean the engagement of the cannoneers by sharpshooters, but which instead resulted in the overeager Jenkins ordering his brigade to charge the guns across the open field. 14. This action was soon followed by Longstreet's other brigades mobilizing along the line, which brought about a general fight around 4 p.m. 15. Although belated and not initiated in the coordinated fashion as Lee planned, the combined assaults by the divisions of A, P, Hill, and Longstreet, under Longstreet's overall command, would be the only units to follow Lee's order to attack the main Union concentration. Longstreet's 20,000 men were not joined by the Confederate divisions of Huger or Jackson, despite their concentration within a 3-mile, 4.8 kilometers, radius. Longstreet's troops assaulted the disjointed Union line of 40,000 men, arranged in a 2-mile, 3.2 kilometers, arc north and south of the Glendale intersection, but the brunt of the fighting centered on the position held by McCall's Pennsylvania Reserves Division, 3rd Division of the V Corps, 6,000 men just west of Fraser's Farm and north of Willis Church. Though the farm was now owned by R. H. Nelson, many locals still called it Fraser's Farm. 16. McCall's division consisted of 3 brigades, Brigadier General George G. Meade. S. 2nd Brigade deployed on the right, Brigadier General Truman Seymour's 3rd Brigade deployed on the left, with the 1st Brigade of Brigadier General John F. Reynolds, presently commanded by Colonel Seneca G. Simmons following Reynolds' capture at Bosun Swamp after Gaines Mill, held in reserve to the rear of center. 17. Also attached to McCall's division of Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiments and 2 batteries of the 1st Pennsylvania Artillery were 3 batteries of artillery from the Colonel Henry Hunt's Artillery Reserve of the Army of the Potomac, Captain Otto Dietrich's Battery A, 1st Battalion, New York Light Artillery, Captain John Nearing's Battery C, 1st Battalion, New York Light Artillery, and a regular Army company, Lieutenant Allenson M. Randall's Battery E and G, 1st U.S. Artillery, replacing Captain Henry de Hart's Battery C, 5th U.S. Artillery, usually attached to the division, which had been overrun and lost 3 of its guns at Gaines Mill. 11. Incidentally, of all the units of the Army of the Potomac present on the peninsula, McClellan and his corps commanders had tasked the critical defense of this Glendale crossroad to units of the V Corps, the only corps heavily engaged north of the Chickahominy at Gaines Mill, in particular to McCall's Pennsylvania Reserves, which had been disproportionately engaged and suffered approximately 2,000 casualties during the fighting at Beaver Dam Creek and Gaines Mill, consequently entering the fighting at Glendale in a greatly diminished capacity. 11. One historian of the Pennsylvania Reserves wrote of the division at Glendale, most of the men were fitter subjects for the hospital than for the battlefield. 18. 3 Confederate brigades were sent forward in the assault, from north to south. Brigadier General Cadmus M. Wilcox, Colonel Micah Jenkins, Anderson's brigade, and Brigadier General James L. Kemper. Longstreet ordered them forward in a piecemeal fashion over several hours, and they were greatly hindered additionally by the difficulty of the terrain and overgrown forest. The 14th Alabama Infantry was one of the first units to advance and bore the brunt of the Union fire, after which they were nearly annihilated. The 14th Louisiana also suffered many casualties and would thereafter refer to the battle as the Slaughterhouse. 19. Kemper's Virginians charged through the thick woods first and emerged in front of 5 batteries of McCall's artillery. In their first combat experience, Kemper's brigade conducted a disorderly but enthusiastic assault on the Whitlock farm, which carried them through Seymour's 2 1st New York Parrott rifle batteries on McCall's extreme left flank. This sudden disturbance caused McCall to deploy his reserve brigade under Simmons from the center to the left to answer the charge, leaving his right flank weakened and vulnerable. Colonel Simmons, commanding the countercharge, was mortally wounded while driving Kemper back into the woods. Soon thereafter, the Confederates emerged opposite Meade's brigade and proceeded to break through the main line with Jenkins' support near the right center, followed up within a few hours by Wilcox's brigade of Alabamians in the center and right. Monday's fight, the Battle of Charles City Road, fought by Heintzelman and Franklin. Harper's Weekly, August 9, 1862, by Alfred Vaude. During the course of the battle, fighting gradually shifted from McCall's left, Kemper's assault at the Whitlock farm, through the center, Jenkins' initial probing assault on Captain James H. Cooper and Lieutenant Frank P. Amston's 1st Pennsylvania artillery batteries, and to his right, Jenkins/Wilcox's combined assaults on Meade's brigade where McCall's division met Cunney's in the New Market Road. The Confederate brigades met stiff resistance from Meade and Seymour in bitter hand-to-hand combat, where men stabbed each other with bayonets and used rifles as clubs. Officers even took to using their typically ornamental swords as weapons. Jenkins' brigade briefly captured Captain James H. Cooper's 6 10-pounder Parrott rifles, but were soon repulsed by the supporting infantrymen of the Pennsylvania Reserves regiments. 20. Confederate troops charging Randall's battery, illustration by Allen C. Redwood. Wilcox enjoyed the most successful assault near dusk when half of his brigade, the 8th and 11th Alabama Infantry Regiments, emerged on McCall's right and found it exposed. To answer the earlier assault against McCall's center, Lieutenant Randall's battery, E&G, 1st U.S. Artillery had changed front to the left, facing his 6 12-pounder Napoleon guns southward to rake Jenkins' regiments with devastating enfilading fire, but exposing his own right flank to the west in turn. When Wilcox's regiments emerged from the woods, Randall quickly changed fire to the west once more, supported by Captain James Thompson's Battery G, 2nd U.S. Artillery of Cunney's division to his right, but his supporting infantry units had shifted toward the center and in his front. After successfully repulsing with canister shot the first 2 Confederate infantry charges made upon the battery, Randall's infantry supports, either the 4th or 7th Pennsylvania Reserves, charged the retreating 8th Alabama to the front of the guns, but met an unexpected fresh Confederate regiment coming up, the 11th Alabama. They broke toward the rear and retreated through the battery, leading the 11th Alabama Infantry right into the guns before they could fire in defense. Intense hand-to-hand fighting resulted around Randall's guns, observed by McCall and described by him as one of the fiercest bayonet fights that perhaps ever occurred on this continent. 21. Meade was severely wounded in the arm and back during the fighting while attempting to rally his men, and Colonel Elisha B. Harvey of the 7th Pennsylvania Reserve Regiment was gravely wounded when he was run down by a runaway caisson. Wilcox's regiments were driven off, but soon returned supported by the brigades of Brigadier Generals Roger A. Pryor and Lawrence Branch before Randall's cannoneers could remove their 6 artillery pieces from the field. 22. McCall was captured when he mistakenly rode into the Confederate picket line after nightfall, looking for positions to place his rallied men. Seymour assumed command of the division, though he was also wounded. Generals Sumner and Heintzelman were both hit by stray bullets in the fighting. The former suffered no serious injury, but the latter was unable to use his right hand for a few weeks. Captain George W. Hazard, commanding Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, was also mortally wounded. 23. On McCall's northern flank, The division of Brigadier General Philip Kearny held against repeated Confederate attacks with reinforcements of Caldwell's brigade and 2 brigades from Slocum's division. On the southern flank, Brigadier General Joseph Hooker's division repelled and once pursued minor attacks. Sedgwick's division, whose brigades had returned from near White Oak Swamp, came up to fill a gap after a brutal counterattack. Heavy fighting continued until about 8:30 p.m. Longstreet committed virtually every brigade in the divisions under his command, while on the Union side they had been fed in individually to plug holes in the line as they occurred.
Now this is White Goat Swamp.
Jackson's men marched south on the White Oak Road with their artillery chief, Colonel Stapleton Crutchfield, at the head of the column. They marched slowly because they were accompanied by thousands of wounded Union prisoners and many of the stores that they obtained at Savage's Station. They found that the single bridge over the swamp had been burned 2 hours earlier. Jackson arrived at noon and approved Crutchfield's gun emplacement that was designed to fire diagonally from a ridge across the swamp against the Union batteries and infantry positions that they saw about 300 yards, 270 meters away. At 2 p.m. on June 30th, 7 Confederate batteries of 31 guns opened fire, catching the Union troops by surprise and disabling several of their cannons. 9. After ordering his engineers to begin rebuilding the bridge, Jackson directed Colonel Thomas T. Munford's 2nd Virginia Cavalry to cross the swamp and capture some of the Union guns abandoned during the bombardment. As the men and horses waded through water that was belly deep and fouled with debris, Jackson and Major General D.H. Hill crossed the river to perform a personal reconnaissance. A Union artillery shell exploded only a few feet away from the generals mounted on horseback, although neither was injured. Jackson saw that Union artillery and infantry was reinforcing the position, and that Federal sharpshooters would play havoc with his engineers on the bridge. He realized that this was not a place that he could make an opposed crossing. 10. Munford reported that he found a ford, Fisher's Ford, a quarter of a mile downstream that would be suitable for the infantry to cross. Brig General Wade Hampton found a closer point at which a simple bridge could be built for infantry. Jackson ordered him to build the bridge, but took no specific action to cross the swamp, having decided that it was infeasible to attack if he could not cross his artillery. While the artillery duel across the swamp escalated to over 40 guns, and while the battle at Glendale raged less than 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, away, Jackson sat beneath a large oak tree and fell asleep for over an hour. The 7 days battles ended the Peninsula campaign. Malvern Hill was not a tenable position in which to stay, and the Army of the Potomac quickly withdrew to Harrison's Landing, where it was protected by Union gunboats on the James River. The Army was in no condition for a renewed offensive. Nearly 16,000 men and officers had been killed, wounded, or captured between June 25th and July 1st, particularly in the V Corps, which had done the heaviest fighting. Also, the survivors were extremely tired after a week of fighting and marching with little food or sleep. Most of the artillery ammunition had been used up, and the summer weather was taking its toll with the Army sick list getting longer and longer. Meanwhile, the equally exhausted Army of Northern Virginia, with no reason to remain in the James Bottomlands, pulled back to the Richmond lines to lick its wounds. McClellan wrote a series of letters to the War Department to argue that he was facing upwards of 200,000 Confederates and that he needed major reinforcements to launch a renewed offensive on Richmond. McPherson notes that the maximum number of Army of Northern Virginia troops that Lee could bring was in fact 92,000. 67 McClellan argued that by giving him the commands in Northern Virginia, troops from the Washington garrison, and whatever forces could be pulled from the west, he might have a fighting chance. General-in-Chief Henry Halleck replied that McClellan's requests were impossible, and that if the Confederate Army was really as large as he claimed, trying to reinforce him with Pope and Burnside's commands in Northern Virginia would be suicide, since the Confederates could easily crush either Union army with their overwhelming strength. Halleck also pointed out that mosquito season was coming up in August, September, and remaining on the swampy Virginia Peninsula at that time of the year would be inviting a disastrous malaria and yellow fever epidemic. On August 4th, the order came down for McClellan to withdraw from the peninsula and to return to the Aquia Creek area at once. 68. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia suffered about 20,000 casualties, 3,494 killed, 15,758 wounded, and 952 captured or missing, out of a total of over 90,000 soldiers during the 7 days. McClellan reported casualties of about 16,000, 1,734 killed, 8,062 wounded, and 6,053 captured or missing, out of a total of 105,445. Despite their victory, many Confederates were stunned by the losses. 69. The number of casualties in the 7 days battles surpassed the total number of casualties in the Western theater of the war until that point in the year. 70. The effects of the 7 days battles were widespread. After a successful start on the Peninsula, which foretold an early end to the war, Northern morale was crushed by McClellan's retreat. Despite heavy casualties, which the less populated South could ill afford, and clumsy tactical performances by Lee and his generals, Confederate morale skyrocketed, and Lee was emboldened to continue his aggressive strategy through the Second Battle of Bull Run and the Maryland Campaign. McClellan's previous position as General-in-Chief of all the Union armies, which had been vacant since March, was filled on July 23, 1862, by Major General Henry W. Halleck. But McClellan retained command of the Army of the Potomac. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee embarked on a thorough reorganization of the Army of Northern Virginia by forming it into 2 corps, commanded by James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson. Lee also removed several generals, such as John Magruder and Benjamin Huger, who had performed poorly during the 7 days battles.
Okay, that was the Peninsula Campaign, but I forgot to tell about the last battle of it, Marvin Hill. But I'll get to that in another video. But that was the Peninsula Campaign.
Well, I am a modern hero. My name is Paddy Carney. Not long ago I landed from the bogs of sweet Killarney. I used to cry out so fat because that was my trade, sir, till I listed for a soldier boy with Corcoran's brigade, sir, for to fight for Uncle Sam. He'll lead us on to glory, ho, he'll lead us on to glory, ho, to save the stripes and stars. For once in our regimentals, me mind indeed we wheeler, I bid goodbye to Biddy dear and all the darling chiller. Oh, says I, the Irish volunteers, the devil of one afraid is, because we've got the soldier boy McClellan for to lead us, for to fight for Uncle Sam. He'll lead us on to glory, ho, he'll lead us on to glory, ho, to save the stripes and stars. We soon got into battle, we made a charge of bayonets. The rebel blackguards soon gave way, they fell as thick as peanuts. Och, on the slaughter that we made, with that it was delighting, for the Irish lads